In the global history, slavery has been a social practice that has existed in most civilizations. And it's an act where some persons are property of another person. And looking at the known civilizations that existed in global history, you will see some level of slavery structures that existed in them. This can be seen in realities of forced labor and other structural concepts that existed in them. Well, this social system where someone or group of people become the property of others sometimes can come with a high level of brutal condition or inhuman condition. There are documentations that tend to present that slavery had existed in ancient times. Some of the notable civilizations and political units have some level of slavery activities within their social structures. Now let's look at the documentation of J.C. Annene. J.C. Annene stated that the ancient records of the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, the Persians, the Indians, and the Chinese are full of references to slaves and the type of labor on which they were usually employed. Slavery was a fundamental institution in many ancient civilizations, and this played a very important role in their economic structures, social hierarchies, and cultural ideologies. From Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and Rome, the practice of human bondage varied in form and function, but it was consistently used to exert control, facilitate labor, and at the same time establish social order. J.C. Annene went ahead to state this, that with the Greeks and the Romans, the institution of slavery reached new heights. Their economy came to be dependent upon slave labor. The Greek colonies in the Mediterranean were founded by Greek pirates who descended on the towns and sold the population into slavery. Analysis of Greek society tend to point towards the high existence of slavery-related practices, as presented by Aristotle. He stated that certain persons or certain people are naturally free, others naturally slaves. For the latter, slavery is both just and expedient. Now let's look at some considerations of some of these civilizations. Let us start from the Mesopotamia, slavery in Mesopotamia. One of the earliest codification of slavery appears in what is referred to as the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi. And this Code of Hammurabi tend to distinguish between free citizens, debt slaves, and chattel slaves. G.R. Driver and John C. Mines, in their documentation titled The Babylonian Laws, tend to express it in this way. They stated that the Code of Hammurabi explicitly differentiates between free citizens, debt slaves, and chattel slaves, indicating the stratified nature of Mesopotamia society. Another documentation that tend to explain slavery in Mesopotamia was that of Igor Diakonov. Igor Diakonov, who was a Russian historian, he expressed that debt slavery was particularly common, with individuals entering servitude due to financial hardship rather than conquests. So generally, slaves in Mesopotamia were used in agriculture, domestic labor, and even skilled crafts. While some could earn freedom, others remained in perpetual bondage, particularly prisoners of war and those born into slavery. Now let's look at the slavery activities in ancient Egypt. The role of slavery in Egypt is more ambiguous than in other Asian societies. While large-scale construction projects like the pyramids were traditionally believed to have been built by slaves, recent scholarship suggests that many laborers were actually conscripted peasants rather than chattel slaves. So, as documented by Barry J. Kemp, who was an English archaeologist and Egyptologist, he argued in his documentation titled Ancient Egypt: Anatomy of a Civilization. He stressed that the distinction between forced labor and chattel slavery in Egypt remained blurred, as many workers, though not technically slaves, lived under coercive conditions. While in a general capacity, foreign captives, especially those of them from Nubia and the Levant, were often enslaved and employed in household, mines, and temples. Let us go to the Greek society. Let's look at slavery in classical Greece. Ancient Greece, particularly Athens, was heavily dependent on slave labor. Van Galen, who was a French historian, tend to have presented it in this way in the documentation tagged Slavery in Ancient Greece. This historian presented it in this way: Athens in the 5th century BCE was a slave society where an estimated 1/3 of the population was enslaved, working in households, mines, and workshops. Well, basically, slaves were acquired through war, piracy, and trade, with many working in brutal conditions, such as the mines of Laurium. So let's go back to a little bit also to the documentation linked to Aristotle in his book or his document tagged Politics. Aristotle stated it in this way. He stated that the slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. Well, this dehumanizing view reinforced the institution as a natural part of Greek society. Let's go down to slavery in ancient Rome. Rome's expansion intensified slavery, with millions enslaved through conquests. The expansion of Rome encouraged and created slavery conditions, with a good number of these enslaved people gotten through conquests. Kate Hopkins, a British historian and sociologist, observes it in this way in his documentation titled Conqueror and Slaves. Kate Hopkins stated that the Roman Empire's expansion was fueled by mass enslavement of conquered people, with slaves constituting up to 30% of Italy's population by the 1st century BCE. Roman slavery was exceptionally harsh, particularly in agriculture, referred to as latifundia, and also in mining. Latifundia, or latifundium, here tend to make reference to any large ancient Roman agricultural estate that used a large number of peasants and slave laborers. Well, a philosopher named Seneca the Younger, whose full name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, tend to create some level of moral reservation in his documentation tagged Moral Letter to Lucilium. He wrote that treat your inferior. Well, I can say he gave more of instruction. Treat your inferior as you would wish to be treated by your superiors. Remember, he whom you call your slave sprang from the same stock, enjoys the same sky, breathes, lives, and dies just like as you do. Now let's go down to the documentation of the documents referred to as Ulpian Digest. Despite this sentiment that can be linked to Seneca, the document tagged Ulpian Digest, which was linked to a prominent Roman jurist by the name Ulpian, tend to define slave status. The definition tends to look at slaves as property. And this definition went this way: slavery is an institution of the law of nations by which one person is subjected to the dominion of another, contrary to nature. So this tends to explain the Roman acceptance of slavery situation within the Roman territory, especially in Rome, and then mainly the area someone can refer to as the Italian area. And let's look at comparative perspective. To consider this comparative perspective, let us look at the documentation linked to an American historian called William L. Westerman. William L. Westerman, in his documentation tagged the slave system of Greek and Roman antiquity, expressed it in this way. He stated that while Greek slavery was largely urban and domestic, Roman slavery was more brutal, with vast number exploited in agriculture and mining under deplorable conditions. Let me take that presentation again. So while Greek slavery was largely urban and domestic, Roman slavery was more brutal, with vast number exploited in agriculture and mining under deplorable conditions. Now, to explain more of this as well was the documentation linked to David Brown Davis. He was an American intellectual and cultural historian. In his documentation titled Inhuman Bondage, David noted that ancient slavery differed fundamentally from racialized chattel slavery of the Americas. Yet, both systems shared the dehumanization of the enslaved as property. Basically, slavery in ancient civilization was a complex and deeply entrenched institution, varying in form, and function across societies. Whether through debt bondage, war captives, or hereditary servitude, slavery underpinned economic and social hierarchies. While some ancient thinkers questioned its morality, the institution persisted as a normal aspect of antiquity. What someone can say that the ancient slavery played a very important role in what later became the slavery that someone can refer to as the dark period of human history, making reference to the period that human beings were practically sold as slaves, making reference to the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade, and any other form of slave trade that must have existed in the global history. Well, unfortunately also, some level of racial reality came to be, implemented or to be presented in the operation of this slave trade.